Hey guys, it's Jack. I just wanted to talk to you today about a way that you can help support the podcast if you're not already. To support the channel is to become a Patreon member. So we have Patreon memberships that start at just $5 a month. And when you sign up, you get access to all of our episodes ad free. That's the big bonus for that. I mean, we also do some Patreon bonus episodes for our subscribers. But this is the biggest and best way that you can support the Team House channel and podcast if you'd like to. And we really appreciate that. So go and check us out at patreon.com/the Team House.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Milburn, and there is D. We're down to just two hosts for this episode of Eyes On, but no matter because we have an extremely exciting guest, Chad McCoy. I say that I know some people will say about every guest, but Chad in particular is a nugget we're very glad to have for a number of reasons that you will find out over the course of the next hour. Just a little bit about Chad. Some of you guys will have probably seen him on the Team House. He did an excellent episode. It was a few months back, right?
I think it's
And
over a year now or
oh, what
close
was it
to it.
really? Okay,
Yeah.
and look him up on the Team House because anyone who is familiar with Air Force Special Operations, who even knows a little about it, may well have heard of Chad. He will avoid the term expert, but I would challenge AFSOC to find someone who knows honestly more about the business, everything from combat controlling. Um, and he gives a fascinating rundown of how that evolved in JSOC, where he spent most of his career, all the way up to the problems that he's dealing with now since getting AFSOC, out of AFSOC with drones, which we're going to turn over to him now to talk about. So, Chad, welcome, and the floor is yours. To begin with, would love to hear perhaps not your origin story. We've heard all of that, but your origin as a civilian story, transition, and what you've been doing since getting out of the military.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. D, yeah, appreciate allowing me to talk on something that's near and dear to my heart, not only because as a business owner, this is what I do day to day, but also because I believe that this is, fundamentally a shift in tactics, employment, and strategy. And so, me being a part of that, kind of rewind the tape a little bit to when I got out. It started with a transition that's painful for most military guys. It wasn't easy. I've talked to other folks about transition in the past, but that's a whole new selection, right? So when you get out of the military, you got to find a home, you got to find a team. Usually the first one you land on is not where you stop. It's kind of like, going to the army as an 11 Bravo, and then you go to selection, and you keep kind of climbing the rungs of where you can go. Transitions much the same. It's got different challenges, and candidly, my life in business has been just as hard or harder than my military career in a different way. Mentally exhausting, long hours, long days. Not necessarily a physical threat, but certainly there's lots of snakes in the grass and lots of landmines, and people are are probably more dangerous on the outside in the business world than they are, within a team room or within an organization of trusted people. So, learning a lot, and hopefully have a lot to share with guys so they don't make the same mistakes I did when I got out.
So how did you transition to starting up your own business, specifically Firestorm? And how did it come together? And what was the catalyst? What is the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, so my first job out of the military, I was working at an innovation institute that supports munitions development in Florida, and I did that for about a year. I did it for exactly a year. I told my wife I was ready for something else. I just wanted a different challenge. I wanted to maybe be in an organization that was willing to take a little bit more risk and change some paradigms. The U.S. DoD, it's a slow moving machine, as most know. Not only on the acquisition side, but on the development side. So usually programs, they're not like 1 to 2 year programs to build a new missile or bomb. It's a 10-year program. And so a lot of times what we've seen in the past 20 years is that when an operator says, hey, I have a requirement, 10 years is insufficient. And by the time you get that requirement fulfilled, the technology could potentially is obsolete. And so within special operations, which got a really good rap for tech adoption, they were doing COTS, so basic commercial off-the-shelf solutions, just to rapidly integrate something. And so it wasn't perfect, but it worked. And so even in business now, I continue to reiterate that it doesn't have to be perfect, just has to be done. And so 80% sometimes is good enough. And that certainly is the thought process in SOF. And so DJI drones, when they initially came on the battlefield, it was because, if the US was going to build a quadcopter, it was going to cost them probably $1 billion, and it would probably do half the things that the Chinese can make for, under 1,000. And so, the expectations of what we receive were in my face in that role, and I realized I wasn't going to change that system. And so when I left that that position, which was a great position, it was a good learning experience for me. I was introduced to a couple of guys out of California, and their intention was to democratize the air through low-cost cruise missiles. And
can you just explain that term very quickly? Democratize the air. I know it's on your website, and I've heard it before. It makes perfect sense, but go ahead.
Democratize everything, right? So but democratizing the air is giving countries, smaller countries like Ukraine, a fighting chance to stand up against larger countries with billions of dollars of military equipment. And so if really the air can be accessible, which it wasn't in years past, right? It was fixed wing assets that had to be survivable. You have huge defense budgets to achieve that mass or those effects on target. Democratizing the air made it accessible to everybody. And so this concept of a $10,000 cruise missile wasn't really super compelling for me, because I knew how good the big defense primes were at building those systems. Like they're excellent at it. And so despite all the criticism of the defense primes, defense industrial complex, they do a lot of things really well. They build fifth-gen fighters better than anybody on the planet, right? They build aircraft carriers, all these big things. But when you go into the smaller scale, there's not a huge incentive for them to do it. And so the idea of Firestorm initially was, let's build these systems low cost. Let's figure out a way. And as we started peeling back the onion in our first conversation with the other two co-founders, the discussion was, well, we can 3D print these systems. And then I started thinking, I was like, okay, I'm thinking edge manufacturing, right? I'm thinking as a soft guy, if we can 3D print them here, can we 3D print them there? And then it was, here's the kind of the fuselage and frame. And I'm thinking, well, it doesn't have to be a cruise missile. It could really be anything that flies. And as a soft guy, knowing that we're not going to have air support, right? You're not going to have ISR. You're not going to have strike assets. You're not going to have PR CASEVAC, because when we're talking great power competition, they own the skies just as much as we do. And I started thinking, I was like, man, you could have basically all 4 missions in an aircraft. So ISR, EW non-kinetics, kinetic, and then you could even use decoys with these systems. And you start looking at it like a truck. It doesn't have to be a weapon. Now it serves the operator. And so I joined with these guys right in the beginning, and we were off to the races in 22. To what we aspired to do is democratize the air through systems that were, one, low cost, that were accessible worldwide through a new manufacturing process that has really come a long way. And 3D printing, we 3D print our drone in 9 hours and can fly in 36. But that it changes the paradigm completely, because a lot of systems take 6 to 8 weeks to build one, and you can't create mass at the edge, and they're super expensive. And so if I'm an airman in the field and I want to go launch this thing, go strike a target, and I crash it, what's the implications of that? Even for training, if I crash a $400,000 drone in training, what's going to happen to me personally? And so then you become risk adverse. You start taking less, chances in training, which is where we should take most chances in training. And then employment of those systems, like how many systems can I get on target? And as well as I do, Andy, like we don't shoot one system. We launch, 2 to make one, and usually it's 3 or 4. And so that's the genesis of it. There's a ton that I'm missing in here, but that's just kind of the high level of what we're trying to do.
It's the competitive edge that the more sophisticated, richer militaries have enjoyed, for for decades is gone. The reliance on air superiority. And then, and you describe it very well. And at the same time, for instance, in Yemen, I mean, we talked about Ukraine and Yemen, we've got a Houthi rebel group now that's using cheap Iranian guidance kits to build, anti-ship missiles that are having an effect on global trade. And yes, largely a token strike, but nevertheless strike Tel Aviv and inflict casualties.
That's right.
Over 1,000 miles away. Great examples of what I think you are talking about.
Yeah, the Shaheeds are really showing the world what's capable in the long-range precision strike, and they're a very capable aircraft. They're obviously the Iranian government's, pumping those systems to make them cheaper. So I don't know what they really cost to produce, without the co-op that exists with Iran. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the Houthis. I mean, I was out there during the civil war in Yemen. The Houthis are capable. I mean, they marched on Sana'a, and they came all the way down the coast. I mean, they're a capable force, but they never represented a strategic threat, to the world. Now they're a strategic threat to trade, which is probably the biggest threat we have. That's scarier than, potentially loss of life. I mean, because you think about the implications of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, or the traffic through the Gulf of Aden. That's going to cripple the U.S. economy just as much as everyone else.
So Chad, I wanted to, we talk about the proliferation of drone technology that allows democratization, right? It's, trends like consumer electronics, right? The ubiquity of consumer electronics. But at the same time, ironically, there are things that are hampering US, and not just US, but on the drone side, the fact, for instance, that the Russians have turned EW into this kind of magic box of area denial, right, for drones. I mean, the Ukrainians have struggled with this. They're losing between hundreds and thousands of drones, every month, according to estimates. They're estimating now that they've got a production goal of something like 2 million drones for next year. I mean, these numbers and these lessons are staggering for us in the US, but I'm not sure that we're seeing what you are. I mean, that everyone is seeing what you are seeing. I mean, what are your thoughts about all of this?
Yeah. So Ukraine is. I'll be very careful how I word this, like it's important, but Ukraine is teaching the world a lot of lessons that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And the timing for those lessons are essential for us to respect and learn from. They have been able to, grind, one of the largest and most capable militaries to a halt using commercial systems. And then the disparity between, cost of defensive assets or Blue Force assets on adversarial. I mean, we're talking, I saw a couple of graphs, like 1 million to 1 billion, but the disparity is enormous. And so typically the US government, specifically the US Air Force, there's a bit of a hubris of like what we can do with our capabilities. And you're absolutely right. We've always done these things in simulation, and we've always done them in exercises at Nellis where we simulate a lot of these threats, but we don't put red air against these things and actually shoot them down, right? And EW is grinding things, especially small systems, to a halt. We talk about alt navigation, and so alt PNT. This is a pretty essential aspect for us to address, and we're getting those reps in Ukraine right now, collectively, the collective we, the global we.
Chad, can you explain what that is real quick?
Sure. Yeah, precision navigation and timing. Just how, so you have GPS, but you also have different ways to get a system from point A to point B. And when you have jammers, whether they be GPS or RF jammers, those systems don't know where they are at all times. And so there are higher end ways to find your position, like let's call it celestial navigation. That's been around for a long, long time, but it's not cheap, right? The next one is, you can go off an azimuth and fly and hope you get a GPS log throughout the position. But the other one's visual navigation, right? So now you have a downward facing camera that is potentially doing the same thing you and I would do with a map and compass off of known points on a map. And then you have FPV, which has changed the world, right? So these FPV drones basically are controlled by, ground operators at the tactical level. And they're able to achieve effects on, tanks with a drone that costs them less than $1,000. And we've never seen that before, because guerrilla warfare, and it's been a very small group of capable people that can get close enough to a target to affect it. Now you have standoff, and you can proliferate that technology to everyone in the ground force and completely grind everyone to a standstill, including the US government. And so what the USG is figuring out now is that this is a threat that we have to, be able to take on. And our legacy counter UAS systems that we've used in Syria and Iraq, those RF systems don't work. And so we're learning the cat and mouse game of technology adoption. And us as a company, we have to be really attuned to what's going on and be able to change very quickly. So if you build the best product for today and it can't future proof for tomorrow, it's going to be obsolete the same way that 10-year cycle of weapons development is, because the Russians will figure out a countermeasure to every single thing that's put on the battlefield. And it is a cat and mouse game every day. And in Ukraine, as you know, Andy, like, there are small shops, R&D shops of young, young kids and young adults, not young kids, older kids, young adults, that are literally building systems for alt-nav PNT, all those alt PNT things, on laptops with soldering irons next to them, in unassuming locations. And they're able to build what the big defense primes were charging the US government millions of dollars to do. And we never received it. And so what this is doing is changing in multiple paradigms. It's changing the paradigm of what tech adoption is, but it's also changing acquisition strategies across the world. So all the, first world countries are going, holy crap, how do we get things faster? And it has to come down to an expectation of what we want the defense contractors or defense primes or even the smaller companies provide. And then you have to ensure that you don't have these giant monopolies that vendor lock systems that prevent the future proofing of systems, right? Because there's no incentive for, pick your defense prime. I won't piss anybody off on this, but pick your defense prime and you build the perfect UAS and you vendor lock the radios that you have to go to them for every update, right?
Yeah.
What we've done is we said, absolutely not. We're going to do fully open systems architecture on this. And we're going to create the SDKs and provide them to the folks on the ground so that they can basically integrate their new sensor, their EW payload, their new camera. And we don't need to get paid for that. We want them to have an iPhone for an UAS.
You're giving them the right to continuous software updates.
Yes. And that should be a standard. It should be our call to action as a nation to provide that for the soldier, sailor, Marine, and airman on the front lines, because everyone needs these now, and it's not service specific. It's certainly service agnostic.
So it's really interesting that you're talking about this, because Zelensky, I think just a couple of months ago, but Zelensky, Ukrainian president, for those who haven't been following the news last few years, he's created an unmanned systems force, right? But it's not, it's not like a space force standalone. It's fully integrated throughout the military. I mean, there are drone units, drone squadrons now integrated and linked to conventional forces. And I believe Ukraine's the first country to have done this. They've restructured their military based on drone capability in the middle of a war, right? Because they had to. And we are so, I mean, I just can't imagine the United States turning on a dime. Like, I mean, I don't mean that's not undermining ourselves. I'm just saying we're very cumbersome by.
Well, let me tell you what I've learned since being on the other side of the fence, outside the military. I've learned that there are pockets of folks within the US DoD that get that completely, and they are changing the script. And so it's easy to be pessimistic about the state of things because of these legacy processes. I get that. I'm frustrated with it just the same as everyone else. But what I'm seeing right now, and pick your service, everyone has them. They're saying, how do we employ these systems? And they're doing it at smaller scale, which they have to, right? Because you're changing maneuver forces now.
Yeah.
And now, what I think the technology has to provide to make that adoption ubiquitous across the military is it has to be so easy that the 18-year-old private can pull it out of a box and not get training and still launch it and use it. And so typically there's a training requirement for every system. Like, you have to be a US pilot, some of you have to be Part 107. And the system you see behind me, this little group one system we're building, the intent is that you hand launch the system. It's sub $10,000, has a 2-pound munition, and it goes into TAC, which is basically this tactical software that everybody has based on a Samsung phone now, and it's proliferating across the forces. But basically Uber for CAS, right? So you say, I've got a target beyond that ridge line. I can't shoot it with my rifle. Usually this is when a mortar team would come out and they would launch 10 mortars to maybe get on target if they're lucky. Now I'm saying you launch this thing up with 2 systems, one spots for you, potentially does a buddy lays if you have a more exquisite system, and then you strike it with limited CDE, limited shots, right? And then we can keep moving the convoy. And if we had these during the GWAT days, the LMAMs that we initially had out in Afghanistan and Iraq, that you had to have, there was precision involved in this. You actually had to know what you're doing to hit something. And so the use case that a lot of the big primes were saying is like, you've got a guy putting an ID on the side of the road. Now we can strike him from 2K out. Well, yeah, sometimes you can hit that far. Sometimes they would lost link and go crash in the desert. What I'd like to see is a system that you literally pull out of a backpack. You clip the wings in, right? Because it's so small, it's just like an AT4 or smaller than AT4, hopefully, a law rocket. And we launch this thing up by hand. So vertical takeoff and landing, thrust vector controls, the controls that move the motor. We launch this thing up and we go strike targets at 5K. And we do it for sub $10,000. Now we have an economy. And that's something you can proliferate to every single soldier within the 18th Airborne Corps.
Which is a world away from our current model, with very expensive systems.
Super expensive, yeah.
But it's certainly the most practical solution that I've heard to this, this buzzword concept, any sensor, any shooter, because what you're talking about is any sensor, best shooter. And it's AI that figures that out, essentially, right?
Yeah.
That's
the big one.
So all that we're hearing, all that stuff's happening. Virtue of AI, and that kind of gets us to autonomy, right? Because you talked about a very basic. I mean, you took a very basic method basic methods of getting around GPS blocking. Terrain mapping, being one of them, but that gets increasingly more sophisticated, and the goal now essentially is having systems that are so autonomous that they not only can bypass countermeasures, but make decisions and strike by themselves. Can you, you talk about this a little bit on your website, you use the terms, but I know it's an immensely tough topic to talk about for ethical terms too. And, within our,
I don't have any issues with any of the
what I meant is explaining. Yeah, Chad, and I don't think anyone here has any issues, but explaining that to civilians that it's not an issue.
Yeah, this isn't. I mean, is it a killer robot? I guess it is a killer robot. It's a bit dramatic though. So there's a couple of things I'll back up on. So AI is such a broad term; it's misused all the time. The military loves to misuse it. Our head of autonomy rolls his eyes anytime anyone says AI, including me. But when you talk about AI,
you gotta have it in there because these gotta use it in as buzzword.
You just sprinkle
it
in a random sentence. I'll be talking to like a landscaper and be like, does this machine have AI in it?
It's on Dee's Tinder profile.
yeah. So AI, alt nav is AI empowered and driven. I mean, it's really the compute in the back end to be able to make decisions that a human typically had to, right? So we're talking about analog switches on and off. Well, can the sensor determine what it needs to do next? And so, that's proliferated across almost every aspect of what we do now. But the thing that you're talking about is what we call ATR. And so, it's this target recognition, these algorithms to it's glorified object detection. And so within a camera system, you have a back end, and then the AI or the compute on the camera is able to look at a target and say, not even use a target, an object, and say that's a vehicle. Okay, cool. So if we put these mission parameters in and say we want to find vehicles, it can loosely kind of find that. When it gets to the next step, it's like, okay, what color are you looking for, or what type of vehicle? And then now we're starting to go down the list of now we need the data sets, whether they be synthetic data sets. So basically we design them and train the models on synthetic, or we train them on real data sets, which are, let's say it's a system that only China has and we don't know what it looks like. we can't do that until we have that real data set. And so that's when the military comes in, NSA, all those folks. But when you have that, you can start training the models. You have to train them from every angle. And so once the brains of these systems can find a target, lock on it, do object detection, determine, through this, these probabilistic, kind of data, and say, okay, this is it. Well, then you still have a human in the loop, right? So now it's like, we need to say yes to that. Well, the problem is, Andy, what you just described is what happens when you're beyond line of sight or you're fully jammed. And now the expectation of that system is to make a decision and go strike. That happened in Libya. And as you guys know, the first fully autonomous strike was done in Libya. I think it was in 2018 or 2017. It was a long time ago.
Can you talk a little bit about that, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what I know. I mean, I wasn't out there when it happened. But yeah, I forget who owned the drone. People said it was the Russians. I don't know who actually was, sent it up. But it was a fully autonomous strike in Libya with a UAS, a small UAS, and it was lethal. And it was the first time that it had been a complete autonomous strike without a human in the loop. And it scared everybody. And it scared everybody because there was no policy behind it. Like, how do you control this? But what I would argue is, and I'm not arguing for fully autonomous systems just yet, but I think they're going to lower the collateral damage. I think you're going to have higher effectiveness of systems because a human can make mistakes, right? And so can an optical system, right? It can be a cloud, something could change, maybe the geometry is different, and it doesn't know how to process that. So there's right now we're not there yet, but I think in the future this can actually be a safer way to conduct warfare. And then I'll take a step back and go to Ukraine. And so if we have a flot, right, and we have a linear, kind of forward edge of the battle space, and we're saying this is the flot, anything on here is bad, everything on the side is good. Well, there's no civilians walking in and out of that area, right? So this is just little green men we're fighting. Now, when you launch systems up there and they find a human, I think you have a 99.9% chance that it's the right person, right? And so when you have a linear battle space, it's very easy to kind of process this type of warfare. But when we put that in an urban context and we're saying it's an HVI, and maybe it's a seeker that's honing in on an electronic signal. So typically, in my former life, we'd hunt cell phones, right? And the individual hopefully is associated with a cell phone. And a lot of times houses got dropped because a cell phone was in there, right? And we said, okay, high confidence, right place, right time, we drop it. Well, crap, man, like you don't know who's in that building. And so a lot of, innocent lives were lost on a human in the loop targeting model. But if the guy's walking on the street with a cell phone, right place, right time, and now we can start doing facial detection, right? Maybe it's a quadcopter that locates him, checks his ears, the spacing, he's the right guy. We have high confidence, the probability is high, and it goes and strikes on its own. Like, tell me that's not safer than dropping JDAMs on entire, buildings with, women and children in it just to kill one guy. I think that's a spray and pray that we shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, we already, a couple of points on that. I think, in support. One is we've been using autonomous weapons actually for a long period of time, but mostly in kind of self-defense, like not CRAM, what's it?
CWIS?
CWIS, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But to your point specifically about the reliability of human decisions versus the emergent reliability of AI. In the medical profession, they're already, based on, experimentation, as they've already seen that diagnosis, certainly, for instance, cancer diagnosis, AI is becoming statistically far more proficient than a human provider, based on it being shown the same evidence, as it were. I'm not wording it well, but you understand what I'm saying. So we're already putting lives in the hands, in a positive way, of AI, right? Yes, a human still backs that up, but it's AI that spots the anomaly. And so because we have enough trust already in that part of AI and lives depend on it, ethically, I don't see a big jump to what you and I are talking about. And especially when you talk to, as you have the end state, which is humans actually are far more prone to error, and our old Watt methodology for targeting was deeply flawed from, it was from a pragmatic as well as an ethical standpoint. despite all the technology we have.
Policy is
Yeah.
the biggest limitation here. It's policy. And so,
Yeah.
we can hold an individual accountable for a mistake. Who do you hold accountable in this chain of command for the system? Is it who plugged in the coordinates or the target parameters? I don't know. I don't have the answers to those. But if we're not thinking about that today, which they're talking about it. There's a lot of, white papers on this and think tanks that talk about it. But I think we're going to be there. And I'm not trying to be the doomsayer but I think we're going to be there faster than we realize. But one example I'd like to bring up though is, in the GWatt days, and those days are gone, so we'll romance over the GWatt days, but the term, call out, which is a lot of people that you guys have talked to about call outs. Call outs were, hey, we're going to come up to set containment on a building. We're going to basically give them the opportunity to give themselves up and come to us peacefully, hands up, turn around, we'll search them. And then if this escalation of force from a call out goes to the point where we destroy your entire house and kill everyone in it, right? And so, but we're okay with that policy, but we're not okay with saying, like Yemen, for example, on the coastline of Yemen, if the Houthis control it, we do a leaflet drop and say, hey guys, listen, civilians, we are going to destroy everything here. So if you live here, it's time to move. We're going to destroy everything that moves here in the next, month, and start creating these, areas that we basically set the conditions. We're doing the call out now, and we will escalate force. But that Houthi situation in Yemen is so solvable to me. And I see a strike every couple of weeks where they're striking like these urban areas, but these guys are launching from the coast. And I get it. I'm not in the military anymore, so I'm an armchair quarterback. But it doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, where they're launching them from, and the second they launch them, there should be a counter battery going out there and shooting those guys. But
can you talk about that a little bit more, Chad? Because I think that's, for what it's worth, I think you're right on target there. But I'd like you to, go into a little more detail on that.
Hurting Houthis.
Yeah, just using the type of solution, the type of solution that you're talking about, which is partly a process, but partly it's linked to emerging technology, right? And that we're still going after this problem in the same way we did all the way through GWatt.
Yeah, it could be because they're trying to get rid of hopefully they're trying to get rid of the stockpiles, but launching tomahawks for one person is not a great return on investment. But we've been doing that for so long. We're so accustomed to it. I remember, years ago in Iraq, they ran out of Hellfires because they shot so many, and they're not cheap. And so I think that, again, I'm not saying that low cost systems like what we're building are the answer for everything. They're not. There has to be a quiver, right? It's super cheap, $1,000 FPVs. That's one thing. That's something that somebody can modify and go strike, use for whatever you're going to use it for. And then you go bigger, group 2, and that's why we have these groups, right? Group 3, 4, 5. Group 5 is, now we're getting to kind of more, they're higher costs. The Air Force still calls them attritable because they're sub 20 million potentially. And then you go into manned solutions. So it's this escalation of force, right? And escalation of capability we're talking about.
And expense and resources.
Yeah. But what we're used to doing is, it's like, well, we'll just drop.
We go high end right away.
Yeah.
But I mean, to your point, going back to your solution for Yemen, yeah, I mean, ideally you'd saturate that area with cheap reconnaissance drones.
Yes.
And you would link that to the ability to launch and deliver loitering munitions via FPVs in a short period of time. So maybe you would need a team of Indig or or SFSOF fairly close, but probably not. And it's a very simple
Andy, let me give you an example.
You
You can buy a Group 2 US from us. So let's say our prop version, so our ISR vision, and we're talking 12 to 14 hours of duration, right? And fly this along the coast. And if every single one of them crashed into the ocean after every sortie and you never recovered a single one, you'd still spend less money than flying a manned asset one time. Okay. That's the differentiator we're talking about here. And that is possible. It's not just us. There's lots of companies that can provide this, but when we fly the coast, those systems can be dual use. They can be spotters. They notice, hey, this is our sensor seeker picks up this and we go strike it. And so it doesn't have to be our bird. It could be a family of systems. And so then you go into this network collaborative weapons kind of concept that the Air Force wants for their weapons. They want them to communicate. Well, the US should communicate, but the problem is they don't yet. And so with our family of systems, we want them all to kind of be in this sensor mesh, right? And there's a term called JADC2, and JADC2 is this joint all domain command and control. And it's this, we're building these COPs, these common operating pictures across the world through sensors that are communicating, across the globe, right? Typically we need an MQ9 on station, or we need an exquisite manned asset, or
Yeah,
NSA
just
is
real
going to
quick,
provide us.
MQ9 is it is the it's the Reaper, right?
Yeah, it's the Reaper.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm always getting
Sorry.
the in the MQ1 and the 9. So the MQ9 is a high-end platform. It's about $30 million, I believe, and it's typically what the United States relies on. But we don't have a huge number in stockpile. Chad, you probably got updated numbers, but it's in the hundreds, and yet it's something that it's a great example of a U.S. approach to drone warfare, which, as Chad is arguing, is outdated.
And so on the MQ9 thread, MQ9s are taking a beating over Yemen lately, if you guys seen the news.
Yeah.
But here's what I'd offer. Instead of just, pointing the finger, I'd say what I'd love to see the MQ9s doing is carrying 16 of our Group 2 lethal systems. And we launch those from tubes off the MQ9, and then we protect the MQ9, and we kill everything that shoots at the MQ9. And we start putting countermeasures on this thing to make it more capable, more lethal. And we test it in Yemen. We test it in CENTCOM, right? We get the reps, and then we make this thing durable enough to be a workhorse, within the great power kind of continuum. And when we talk great power competition, I know we're not there yet, but in this conversation, but like we're going to need a lot of systems, because the attritability of these systems is going to be enormous. We're going to lose our inventory. But I think we can win. I think we can win against anyone on the planet Earth, with the right mindset and the right preparation for it. And so that's moving the ship slowly, right? And that takes time, but they're doing it. So
yeah, it's interesting what you said, Chad, about that being maybe a critical mass now of kind of drone disciple or drone advocates, right, within the military at all levels, that perhaps definitely were not there a decade ago. That
I wasn't one of them.
maybe,
I was a critic of them.
yeah, that may be changing the culture for the better. That's a really, really interesting point.
But the reason I was a critic of the systems during my time in service was because I was completely spoiled, and we wouldn't leave our MSS or our FOB without AC-130. It was Min-Force, and so I was spoiled. And whenever we got into a TIG, we always had the best assets to destroy the enemy. And so when we talk about like conventional force by soft, conventional force had to slug it out, right? They actually had to fight through that, their objectives, where we're like, well, we'll just pull back and drop it. But if I was a conventional guy looking for resources, then UAS is literally a force multiplier. Even if it wasn't lethal, even if it can tell me where the enemy's at, and then we can put indirect fires on target, or even artillery. Now you're talking about a game changer for everybody, and that's why it has to remain low cost, in my opinion, within reason, right? You still have to make money as a company, but if you can make it accessible to all these line units, now you basically, soft doesn't have a competitive advantage in this fight. Now it's across the force. And candidly, I think what you're going to see is conventional forces. You're going to see, some, badass kid in the 82nd Airborne is going to figure out how to employ these things in a different way. And he's going to change the game because he has access to technology he didn't have before, and because it's cheap enough for him to break. And so that's what I want to see.
Similar to what happened in Ukraine. I mean, at the beginning of the war, it was kind of still the 10-kilometer line, right? Even with smoke. So what I mean by that is your infantry squad did not have the ability to affect anything beyond 10 kilometers other than with non-organic assets. So I'm talking about reconnaissance and strike. Beyond 10 kilometers, they had to rely on a single radio net, and as it was a bottleneck for in every military, to include the U.S. military. But increasingly now, with FPVs, with drone units being pushed down below the brigade level, you've got more of this network that you're talking about, right? You've got a squad. The FPV dudes are more important than the machine gunners, right? The machine gunners are now like local security guy, the automatic weapons guy, but the FPV guys and the drone guys are that squads ability to reach out and
So let me offer you a solution to everybody listening. And so our jet, our Group 2, which is 55-pound takeoff gross weight, can go between 100 and 150 miles. Okay,
can you just tell us what Group 2 is real quick?
So they have groups, their categories are weight based. And so Group 1s are kind of like the smaller systems, FPV drones, the smaller systems, right? There are some fixed wing drones in the Group 1 category. But Group 2 is really kind of where you start seeing the loitering munitions or the explosive systems. They're about 50 pounds usually. They can be tube launched, they can ground launch, catapult launch. They're bigger, and then just gets bigger and bigger from there. And Group 5 is like a Reaper, right? So MQ-9, the bigger systems. Yeah. So the trade space I'm talking about is in Group 2 space. And just let me give you a hypothetical and something we're building. If our bird can fly 100 miles and it can get past all the enemy air defenses, how low it's flying or how high it's flying, and under wing it's carrying 2 FPV drones, okay? And you just described a 10-kilometer kind of bubble that was your limit of advance or capability. What if I can put those FPV drones 100 miles in, I can deploy them at an altitude and they fly down to target. And now that bird, that Group 2 bird, which is our Tempest bird, is now the relay for the FPV guys to fly their 2 drones in. You have now changed the script operationally. And so we're building that.
No need to deploy soft teams to
do it out of an MSS, do a safe house.
Exactly. Yeah. Not for terminal control, not for anything. Yeah.
It's going to change. We're not. Wow. I hope that soldiers aren't dying unnecessarily. Technology should be filling a big gap for them, and we should see less loss of life on our side.
So. Inshallah. But I think everything you've said makes me more optimistic. We were slow to make the culture change in many ways early on. I mean, remember, I'll give you an example from an infantryman's perspective, okay? I went, in the Battle of Fallujah. Now, looking back, I'm thinking 2004, why the fuck were we sending guys through the door every time? Of course, because it's the Marine Corps and we didn't even have enough grenades to roll in first. Yeah, but that's an inadequate answer. The point is there should have been a better way in 2004, because once we entered that house, we were on equal terms with our enemy. In fact, he had an advantage, and it didn't matter what technology we had behind us. And, I can't help thinking we lost a lot of guys that just, who didn't need to die. I mean, I'm not getting emotional.
My brother was a Marine. My brother was a Marine in Fallujah in 2004. He fought door to door in what you're describing. Yeah. And, he lost, he was a platoon leader, and he lost quite a few guys in Fallujah. And so, yeah, this is near and dear to all of our hearts that served. And Andy, to your point, man, like when you get emotional about this, it's the same way I do as a former operator. Well, this isn't a get rich quick scheme to build drones. This is literally, we're going to change the way we fight. And I believe that with all of my being, is that these systems, if we can remain a low cost price point and everybody can have them in their hands, it doesn't have to have our sticker on it. Force other industries to do the same thing. And then we have solutions for our guys on the ground that deserve these systems. And it's not altruistic, right? This isn't a nonprofit, but what we can do is we can drive a market a direction and change expectations of the DoD for the positive for everybody. It doesn't have to just be for soft, peculiar, or the budgets that can execute things very quickly at lower scale. This has to be something we can proliferate across the forces, man.
Yeah, absolutely, given the right impetus on, on the topic of culture, actually not just on the topic of drones generally. So we've talked about near peer, the role of drones in near peer competition. Before we ship, because I want to talk too about drones in SOF's role, as like the need for a blue collar drone that we can use with Indige and leave behind, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But armed Overwatch, all that shit. But before we do so, I'd just like to hear your comments about really being prepared for near peer warfare and what does have to change.
So I'm contributing more with the company that we started, Firestorm, which I haven't even mentioned once in this call. I'm contributing more on this side of the fence than I ever did in uniform. And I know that emphatically. And it's not to discredit my service or things I did. I did some great stuff, but this is and now I'm able to do the things that I wanted to do in service, but I didn't have the money, resources. I didn't have the wasta as a leader to say, hey, this is where we should be going. No one listened to me. And it's soft, everyone thinks you're important. You're actually not. So once I had that epiphany and I came on the other side, here's how I'll tell you I'm going to address that, Andy, is that so I talked to you guys about the drone we're building, we're 3D printing it. And I said we can print it anywhere in the world. What I failed to mention was our other product is manufacturing. So we have a product that is manufacturing. And what that allows us to do is put a manufacturing line in a Connex box and ship it anywhere in the world and start a drone factory, right? And what we're doing there is we're redefining what the term attritable is, right? And so in the media, if you looked it up, you Google it right now, you'd see a really wide scale of what attritability is. It could be a price point, right? It could be, hey, if it's $100,000, it's attritable. Okay, cool. Put that down in my category of attritable. But truly, if you have 2 systems, Andy, and you're in a Pacific Island chain and you're with your team, those are exquisite assets if you don't get more, right? So if I tell you, Andy, you're not getting any more resupply, you're like, holy crap, I got 2 systems. How am I going to use them? You're not going to use them, in the context of affordable mass. They become this thing that you're going to wait for the right shot. And so attritability to me, price is important, but sustainability is more important, and the ability to produce at the edge. And so what we've created is this manufacturing concept that we can plop down in Indo-PACOM and start producing. And you made a comment earlier about partner forces. So what I would like to see is these capable workforces within these countries, because there's tons of engineers in these countries. They're doing the quality control. They're building our systems for whatever user it is. And then when the soft guys go out there and do a J set or whatever, military exercise they're doing, they happen to provide you now a manufacturing capability to produce your own drone, drone in a box. And now we are basically creating resources within theaters, manufacturing resources that we can turn on as conflict requires. And so to me, as a former military guy, if I can provide that to DoD, I have done more for my country to change the odds in their favor than I ever did, running around with a med ruck and dragging somebody out of a building in a gunfight. I'm talking about potentially, changing the way we fight, like I said in the beginning.
Yeah. So, Chad, I think a really good illustration of that is in Somalia, for instance. But you could name African country, but Africa's a great place.
Africa's a great one.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, whenever it was 2017, the decision was made to kind of disengage. It was later. I can't remember when it was from the Vietnam. It was much later than that. It was around COVID timeframe. And so we did. We pulled out basically from provide. I mean, not completely. We maintained a task force in Mogadishu, but we were no longer doing the advise and assist with the NARB directly. And of course, there was a huge fall off, I think, probably in capability. But the biggest concern at the time was our ability to continue supporting them with fires in collective self-defense, both from a policy perspective, right? Because we no longer had guys with them.
Absolutely.
But mostly just from a practical perspective of just really a target identification it can never be as sure as when you have a guy co-located with partner nation force, right? So that now you're talking about problems and being able to support them, and then allocation of assets, prioritization, because you don't have U.S. forces involved. You're not going to get a high-end asset, right, to support the DNAB. And now there's a black hole. As far as they're concerned, one day they're having U.S. support, and for next day, for no reason they can understand, they're not, and they're getting killed, right? And the Americans are behind in a compound saying, hey, we're behind you, right? That's what so there's, as you point out, there are so many things involved in this that technology can solve and change fundamentally about how some of the ways that we wage war. Now, the solution, and this, I'm not knocking anyone, because I've written about this and in a positive way, but the solution was to go to something called armed overwatch, right? which came down to a manned platform, of course, Air Force, right? At the time. And yet, what you've just talked about gives you armed overwatch at a fraction of the cost, none of the political commitment, and none of the risk.
Pennies, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and here's a couple, vignettes I'll say without disclosing anything classified, is that a lot of times we don't have the authorities to strike bad guys that we know where they're at. We have pattern of life, we have high confidence, we know they're driving from point A to point B. We are just simply not allowed to strike them. And without getting into the full authorities of how this process goes, the country team has the final say. So the ambassador gets to determine whether you're going to strike in a country like that, right? And if the ambassador doesn't want to have the political ramifications or not get invited to cocktail parties, he's probably going to say no. Okay.
More important.
And so, yeah, so we watch these bad guys in all these countries. Well, here's what I'd offer you. I always love the concept of providing target data to other folks legally, and let them do it, and let them clean up their own messes. But what you just described is a perfect example, and Africa is ripe for this. Take Mali, for example, right? Mali is a dumpster fire right now. And if you can enable them with lethal systems, and how about this? You add a command and control link, so you have final approval, right? So now you can still do partner force and advise assist, but you're basically determining, lethal action if you want to babysit, or you can let them go crazy and say, take all the lethal crap you want, you've bought them, go execute. And I think that Africa is a perfect example of that, because, and specifically Mali, we used to fly aircraft, from the Med down there, and you waste freaking 6 to 8 hours of transit time just to get there, and you get 2 hours of station time, and you're not accomplishing anything. So how about this? ISR drones are flying over the city, and I get it. You create a surveillance state in these, these countries, which I have an issue with, but
but you know what? Most of the world is a surveillance state right now.
I know.
I mean, the U.S. is an oasis of non-surveillance that.
Well,
that
China's watching this
most
podcast on Zoom right now, anyway.
So. Luddites,
Yeah. But I mean, I guess it just enables different options.
Yeah. Say again, Andy.
We're still trying to identify murderers via means other than CCTV. All across Europe, it's like, okay, where did it occur? All right, show me the TV. With us, we have to call in fucking, not Miami Vice, it's CSI, and they go for.
Or you have to go to like the neighbor's house and ask them for their surveillance.
I'm sorry, I got us off on this tangent.
Yeah,
it's okay.
No, I love it. Let's go. Let's talk about Ring cameras.
Yeah.
All right, man. Hey, Chad. What have we not? I know we're coming up on our time. What haven't we spoken about that we should have?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a conversation that's going to continue to evolve. There are some experts in the field. I think a lot of them come out of Ukraine. They're the drone operators out of Ukraine right now. I think that the US DoD needs to be listening. They need to be asking the right questions, and then demanding industry adapts to those requirements. I also think that, policy, when you talk about, compliance of non-Chinese parts, it's really hard to, create enough supply chain in the United States to fulfill the appetite of some of the technologies that are out there, specifically in chips. We need Taiwan. Taiwan is strategic for a number of reasons, but mostly because of the semiconductors and things. But so we're at the mercy of kind of a global supply network, and it's a dangerous position to be in, and it's going to force our hand into conflict. And so the United States has to become more self-sufficient, specifically on manufacturing of chips, which they're doing. They've invested a ton of money. I think Arizona has one of those, and I think Florida has one as well. But that's, those are the things that I think about. Camera systems, just not to get on too many tangents, but camera systems are extremely expensive. They're cost prohibitive. And so we need more US companies to stand up and start building components. They're going to go into drones to keep them low cost. And software, proliferation, keeping things open systems, open source, allowing, folks to iterate on these things in the field is where we need to be. And so, I think that it's not all doom and gloom. The United States is making some really good choices. We've got some scar tissue, and we have some bureaucrats that make things difficult. But I think that there is a new regime I know there's a new regime within the tech industry of former military guys that know what the hell to build. I know that for a fact, and I talk to them all the time. But I would also say that decision makers and those senior, GS 14s and 15s are now coming out of the residual conflict we've had for 20 years, and so they have context, and hopefully they're making decisions.
They're not your grandfather's GS 14s and 15s, right?
There's great people in these positions now. And there's people that are trying to change it for the better, and so I'm optimistic. I'm going to bring more solutions than complaints, and so that's my goal.
Chad, we're going to bring you on again.
Yeah, this is great.
This is an evolving, fascinating topic. Needless to say, thank you so much.
We're going to talk about theology next, or spirituality for next hour.
We're open to it all, man. And actually, we are broadening our fan base. So those are great,
That's
and
awesome.
that's a very small leap from autonomous systems to spirituality.
That's true. It is.
it's certainly linked. Okay. Chad,
couple things.
Over to you, man.
Housekeeping. Check out Chad, Firestorm Labs. They're doing incredible stuff. Check out Andy. Also check out Chad's
website is launchfirestorm.com.
Launchfirestorm.com. It'll be in the description and in the show notes. Andy, of course, all the links to Andy will be in the show notes. Our Patreon in the show notes.
Not me necessarily, but my book.
Yes, exactly. And also, I lost my train of thought. Thank you, Andy.
Sorry.
Oh, Chad's episode with us on the Team House will also be in the description if you want to check out and hear about Chad's career. He's going to come on the show again. We're going to get him in New York and liquor him up again.
You can even leave mean comments on the YouTube video about me.
Yeah, we love that.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, if you just very quickly a plug for that video. So, JSOC's kind of AdSOC component, I'm using the wrong term here, is 24th Special Tactics Squadron. And Chad spent most of his career with that squadron, and has some really fascinating insights from everything from initial selection all the way through to how that squadron operates and evolves. What is a PJ? What is a combat controller? What is a TAC-P? What did they become during GWAT, and what do they need to be going ahead? All of this tied in with more war stories than, I'm trying to think of an analogy involving D, but I can't think of one that will allow us to advertise on YouTube.
Honestly, I could see the parallels to what you're doing now, Chad, because, my understanding, the 24th STS is like the Swiss Army knife of JSOC. You guys can do it all. And not just you're here. I'm not just pumping your tires. Like, you guys are probably, in my opinion,
keep it coming. I like it.
The more impressive ones. I mean, everyone's impressive in JSOC, obviously, but you guys do it all. You can adapt. And I think what you're doing now is kind of like, it makes sense. It lends itself to what you're trying to do now.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, super capable guy, super smart. But yeah, man, appreciate it.
And we got a quote from D. Everyone's impressive at JSOC. Just ask him.
Yeah, they'll tell you.
License plate. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Great having you, Chad. D, thank you so much for putting this on.